very much. It's nice to see all of you again. Today we're going to talk about the oversight and management of awards. So we went over in our previous sessions, what you need to put into your proposal, what happens when an award comes, setting up an account. We also discussed sub-recipient monitoring. And so today, as I said, we're going to talk about some of the strategies you need for a successful oversight of federal awards for the duration of the award. Specifically today, we will talk about monitoring expenses because you're going to start to spend your money, which is the fun part. We'll talk about cost transfers and prior approvals. Starting with monitoring spending. So we recommend, and I don't know if you are doing this at IX, but here at Tulane, we are set up to review certain purchases and expenditures before they even get put onto a grant account. And we recommend that you have something in place like this that is separate from the principal investigator or some central office that reviews and approves certain items of cost that are put through by the principal investigator. We identified equipment, travel, salaries, consultants, and sub-award invoices. There are other types of expenses, but we really put a lot of scrutiny into reviewing these expenses. And again, we do that before we allow the expense to hit the grant accounts. We're looking to make sure that these items, of course, are compliant with federal regulations. We're looking to make sure that the budget, the remaining balance in the grant account, can support these activities and these expenses. We're also looking to make sure that travel and salaries, for example, are in compliance with our own university policies that we have to comply with. So okay. So remember our session on developing a budget at the proposal stage when we're submitting a grant proposal. We talked about the types of expenses that are allowed in a budget that is going to a U.S. federal agency. The same thing applies now as you are about to spend your money. Any kind of charges to a grant account have to be allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary. You also have to make sure that you are treating all of your grants consistently. So you don't want to treat one NIH grant differently than another grant from NIH. You want to make sure that you are consistent in the way you review and approve expenditures and the way you are compliant with your own institution's internal processes and policies. A good example about consistency also applies to direct costs on a budget versus indirect costs. So if your indirect costs pay for telephones and postage, things like that, you should not expect to see those as direct costs charged to grants because you're already paying for that through your indirect cost recovery. Costs should be timely. So you should charge an expense close to the date that it was incurred. This is particularly important for travel Travel should be reconciled very soon after the trip has been completed. And actually at Tulane, the policy is that anyone who travels, whether it's on university funds or sponsored projects funds, they have 30 days after they return from the trip to reconcile and put their expenses through the system. And if they fail to meet that deadline, you have to go through all kinds of processes to get things approved, and it's difficult. But that is because you don't want to wait 6 months after a trip has been taken to apply it to a grant in particular, because you might lose receipts, you might not have all the information. So it's really, really important to be timely about the expenses as they are incurred. And of course, you are always going to be looking at any expenditure to make sure that it is compliant with terms and conditions in the sponsored agreement. And again, as I mentioned, you also may need to take into consideration your own policies and procedures to make sure that that the action is compliant with institutional policies. A good example at Tulane is overtime pay. We just can't approve overtime pay on grants. We have to have justification for that because it does not follow university policies and procedures. So we have to carefully watch for those kinds of things as an example of a university policy. So best practices for monitoring expenses: make sure that your accounting records show that the purchases are incurred with the knowledge of the principal investigator. Remember that the PI is responsible for determining how the budget should be spent according to the needs of the project. You might not have the expertise to say that this project needs these laboratory supplies or this travel or these postdocs. The principal investigator needs to be able to determine what does it take for me to conduct my project. But you still need to be the one, you still need to have a setup that reviews any kind of expenditures according to what I just discussed on the previous slide. Is it allowable? Is it reasonable? Is it allocable? Is it necessary? We also recommend, if you can do this, we have difficulty doing this at Tulane because it's such a large operation. But we recommend that you review grant accounts with the PI on a regular basis. Monthly would be ideal if that is something that you can do, because you want to ensure that charges to grant accounts are correct. And if during this process, because mistakes are commonly made, you can have a key punch error or whatever. Sometimes there's a mistake in the way something is applied to a grant account. So when you detect an error, it needs to be corrected and documented according to cost transfer regulations. And we're going to talk about cost transfer regulations next. So what is a cost transfer? It is moving an expense from one account to another. The uniform guidance, and remember the set of federal regulations, so the uniform guidance provides specific requirements and guidelines for cost transfers. And they state that they expect to see clear documentation and justification for cost transfers that are done between grant accounts. Again, they should be completed in a timely manner, and they require full, detailed documentation as to the reason for the transfer. This is a highly scrutinized area by auditors as well as agency officials. So we at Tulane have been through this time and time again. And of course, we're not perfect, but if you have the capacity to meet with the faculty on a regular basis, reviewing their grant accounts, you can minimize the number of cost transfers that you have to do. So here are some red flags. These are something that you need to be aware of. If there's a high frequency of cost transfers, if they are late, if they are not explained well, particularly if you have a grant that is in a deficit in the account. Likewise, if you have a large balance remaining, those are also red flags. And so that raises questions. The auditors will question if you're transferring to try to fix some of those things, whether something is not spent or it's overspent. That is a red flag, and auditors often will look at that very, very closely. You need to keep in mind that there are times when you have to take a cost, an item of cost, and distribute it over many different grant accounts, or maybe 2 or 3 grant accounts. You need to be able to explain why you are charging 20% to one grant, 30% to another grant, and 50% to another grant. So those are the kinds of things that you need to think about and rationalize and document as best as possible. Again, cost transfers, these are the guiding principles. They are for correcting errors. For example, since we know that you're going to start reviewing grant accounts on a monthly basis with your principal investigators, you still may find that there is an error. For example, you might discover that operating supplies were charged to the wrong grant account. This, of course, needs to be corrected. Grant accounts cannot be used to manage available cash balances. So again, we're coming close to an end of a grant award. The project period is ending. My principal investigator has $30,000 left. He's got 2 weeks left in the project period. And he comes to you and says, I want to transfer a lot of my expenditures from one grant account to this grant account because it's ending and I don't want to send $30,000 back to the federal government. That is not allowable, and you need to be careful about doing that. That is a big red flag during an audit. Always remember that project funds are not interchangeable, meaning that the integrity of each grant account has to be maintained. Okay, we're going to talk about these principles again, the fundamental principles, those fundamental tests. When you are transferring costs from one grant to another grant account, you're going to do that same test. Is it reasonable? Is it allowable? Is it allocable? Is it necessary? You have to use the same test to make sure that charge can be transferred on to the other grant for a correction, for example. You also must, again, consistency in the way you handle these things. You have to show a record, a practice of always using the same principles anytime you are doing this as a whole for all of your active grant accounts. Costs that are allocable to several projects cannot be charged only to one single project. So as I mentioned before, when you have this, you might buy, like I say, for example, a faculty member who is doing lab work, some of those supplies can be applied to many different active grants for under that principal investigator. But you can't use one grant to pay 100% for those lab supplies because they're used on the other grant projects. So you have to come up with a rationale for splitting the cost between grant accounts. This is very important. Costs that are not allocable to a project cannot be charged to that project, even temporarily. In English, we call this practice parking. So it's like parking a cost while you're waiting for a new grant to come in or something else is happening or waiting for a new account to be set up. You cannot park charges on one project if it does not apply. This is also a big red flag. This is something that an auditor will zero in on, and you could get into a lot of trouble for parking expenses temporarily. So these are the very high risk areas for cost transfers. In general, cost transfers are fine as long as you are staying on top of it and you're justifying them, of course, and you're using those principles. But it really gets to be problematic if you wait more than 90 days after the original transaction to do that correction, to do that cost transfer. That is something, again, that your accounting records have to reflect. When was that original transaction? When did you do the correction? If it's more than 90 days, you have to provide documentation and a justification or why it took longer than 90 days for you to correct that, for you to make that correction. Another red flag are transfers in the last month of the award or after the award has expired. This is a signal to auditors and the federal agencies that you may not have been managing and overseeing your grant accounts. Because again, like the example, I've got $30,000 left. I'm going to transfer everything onto that grant before it closes out. These are the kinds of things that are a high risk, and they may be disallowed. So you may end up having to pay for those expenses out of your own institutional funds. Another red flag is when you are closing out an account and there is a zero balance. It's really, really difficult to have a zero balance at the end of an award. It might cause a flag for someone to look and say, how did they come up, and how was it so easy for this grant account to come up with everything is spent to the very, very penny. Also, they look at rounding of numbers, rounding up or rounding down. That might be an indicator that you're just plugging in a number and looking at the bottom line rather than, again, thinking, does this cost belong on this grant? Is it allowable? Is it reasonable? Is it necessary? So when you have a round number or you have a zero balance, those are indicators that that you could be doing something strange with your accounting just to try to spend the money down. Labor distribution. This is, of course, how the effort has been spent on the grant accounts. A lot of adjustments in labor distributions, especially if the effort has been certified. This is a problem area for cost transfers. And we're going to spend some time on it in our next session because it's a lot of information about effort and effort certification and effort reporting. So we'll spend time on that in our next session. But again, changing salaries around with frequency is a red flag. And then any kind of transfer that you do that has that does not have a good explanation or uses what we call cookie cutter explanations, those are also a red flag. Here at Tulane, there is a habit of using very non-detailed justifications for some late cost transfers. Like, we did not detect this error until 100 days after it was incurred. I mean, that's not enough of an explanation. So we get into a lot of trouble with that. So just want to point out that you need to always make sure that you have a good rationale for why the transfer is late, and again, justifying why it belongs on the grant that you are transferring the cost to. And then you have to be careful about closely related projects. That's another thing that is scrutinized to make sure that the grant accounts are being treated equally and consistently, that you're allocating across projects when it is necessary. So those are the kinds of things, again, that an auditor will look at. Okay, so that concludes the cost transfers. Again, that is an area for Tulane and for many institutions that have a lot of grant funds. It's very, very difficult to manage. We have over 1,000 active grant accounts here, and a lot of the oversight at a certain level is done in the departments. Just because of the high volume, we don't have a lot of infrastructure in place at the moment that can help with the oversight and the management of awards and the working with the principal investigators on a monthly basis to go over their accounts. We don't have a lot of the infrastructure for that. As a result, we are often faced with late cost transfers. We're getting better at it, and we've reduced the number, but it is, I think, one of the most difficult areas for post-award management is those corrections and the timely corrections and the justifications for those types of changes. So to the extent that IX can put controls in place for this, and to increase your management and oversight and transparency of information and transparency of the accounting with the principal investigators, the more that you can do that, the better the more you will reduce the need for a lot of these cost transfers. Okay. So let's turn now to something else that happens at the award duration stage. There's always going to be needs for changes to a budget or to a program or to personnel. There are two levels of approval for managing changes on federal grants. There are times when a central office, like mine here at Tulane, or the authorized official office and IX, for example, there are times when we can make approvals for certain changes to budgets and other activities. But there are other times when we have to go back to the funding agency to seek prior approval before that activity takes place. Whether it's the internal office at Tulane or IX that makes the approval, or if we have to go to the federal agency to seek their approval, it has to be obtained. The approval has to be obtained before the changes take place. The institutional prior approval system refers to the set of policies and procedures that a grantee establishes for reviewing and approving certain post-award actions related to grants. So again, we call this IPATH. For us, that is a request coming from the principal investigator in writing to our office, and we make the determination if we can approve it or if we have to go to the agency, but we document that process. The best practice, IX should have an IPASS policy that requires the principal investigator to request approvals for post-award changes. A scientific justification for the change is always required, and it's always the best practice. A good example that we encounter frequently is that a principal investigator will say, I want a 1-year no-cost extension because I have a lot of money left in my grant account and I want to spend it. That is not an appropriate justification. So we always have to go back and say, please tell us what you will be doing during the extension. Why is it needed for your project? What is the scientific justification? We cannot just say we want to spend our money, and so we need more time. That is not appropriate, and it will cause a disallowance if that is the way it is documented in your internal system. If this request from the principal investigator, if that can be approved by the IX grantee authorized official, the GAO, or some other authorized office within your system, you're going to have to document that the action that was taken and make sure that it is part of the official grant file that is subject to audit as well. Any requests for changes that require prior approval from the actual sponsor must be endorsed by the grants official, the authorized official at IX, and then sent to the grants officer at the funding agency. Failure to follow procedures for obtaining internal approvals or sponsor approvals can result in disallowed costs or even a termination of a grant. So let's go through some very common changes that require approvals, whether they are internal or whether we need to go back to the sponsor. And I want to say that a lot of this is changing right now because of the current atmosphere with the federal agencies and their grants. So you need to make sure that you are well aware of some of the changes that are coming out of the federal agencies, because they might have an impact on what you can approve internally or when you have to go back to an agency. So first, change in the scope of work. Any modification to the original project plan needs to be approved by the actual sponsor. You cannot approve that internally. This includes adding additional scope to the project, or reducing or deleting some of the work, or significantly altering the scope of work. A lot of that is a judgment call that has to be made in discussions between you and the principal investigator. Any changes to the use of human subjects that were described in the grant proposal and then approved by NIH, if there's any changes to that, or the use of animals, that also requires sponsor approval. I had an instance here at Tulane when a principal investigator was doing a study that involved children, and he noticed something about the behavior of the mothers of the children that he was studying, and so he wanted to add that to his scope of work. That had to go through a big review at NIH, and it took quite a long time, but they approved it. But that is a really good example. He wanted to, instead of just the children, he also wanted to add some aspect to the study that involved the mothers. And that, as I said, is a very good example of a change in scope of work that involves human subjects. Oops. Changes in key personnel. I think you all understand the meaning of key personnel. A change in key personnel requires prior written approval from the sponsor. This includes a reduction in committed effort of more than 25%, or absence from a project for more than 3 months. And this is very common among all the federal sponsors of the US government. For example, Dr. Doolittle, when he submitted his proposal, he wanted to commit 50%. His proposal was awarded. So NIH has an expectation, because they awarded his proposal, that he will continue to commit 50% of his time on this project. However, he needs to reduce his effort to 10% for the next 12 months. That is greater than a 25% reduction. And he needs to, before he reduces his effort on the project to 10%, he needs to get prior approval from NIH. And of course, that would be an approval that would be justified, put in a letter, endorsed by your authorized official at IX, and then sent to the agency. A change of principal investigator or other key personnel identified in the award notice. If you have a change of key personnel other than the principal investigator, you always want to look at the award notice from NIH. They will list the key personnel. So if a co-investigator or a co-principal investigator, you need to look to see who was listed as key personnel. Those are the only people that are listed on the award notice are the ones where you need to request prior approval for changes. So Dr. Doolittle is the principal investigator and Dr. Messy is just his co-investigator. If Dr. Messy is not, if his name does not appear in the NIH notice of award and Dr. Messy leaves or he changes his level of effort, you don't have to worry about Dr. Messy. Only if Dr. Messy is also named in the award notice do you have to worry about getting approval if he changes his effort. Okay, so a change of principal investigator. The example I give here is Dr. Messy is leaving the university and cannot transfer his NIH grant with him. So the grantee institution, the university, wants to replace Dr. Messy with Dr. James Bond. This is, again, something that would require approval from NIH. The approval would be in the form of a letter, documentation of why Dr. Bond is appropriate to take over the grant that used to be in place for Dr. Messy, what his credentials are, what his expertise is, and when he will be taking over as principal investigator. And you need to also provide a biosketch and possibly sometimes a full curriculum vitae for the agency to review. So that, again, is something to keep in mind about the level of detail that you need to provide if you change the principal investigator to someone else. Of course, a change of grantee institution requires approval from the sponsor. So with great frequency, Tulane will have a faculty member who has grants here at Tulane, and they leave Tulane and they go to another institution. Tulane has to relinquish. We can choose to relinquish that grant to the other institution, and that all requires extensive coordination between Tulane and the new institution and approvals from NIH or from any federal agency. So just be aware that a change of grantee institution requires a lot of work and approval from the sponsor. Certain budget revisions can be approved by the authorized official, the grantee authorized official, using that process that I described earlier. But sometimes it requires approval from the sponsor. You are responsible for understanding when a budget revision can be approved by the GAO and when you need to go back to the sponsor. And you need to make sure that you read the terms and conditions carefully. So you're going to be looking, suppose you have a faculty member who wants to do have a new subcontract and wants to revise the budget. You need to make sure that there's, of course, money available, how much the impact will be on the project. And you need to seek prior approval from a federal agency. You need to understand all of the terms and conditions for that particular award and to understand exactly when you need to go back to the sponsor. No cost extensions. No cost, meaning you can add time on to, additional time onto a project. Normally, the first year of a no-cost extension can be approved by the grantee authorized official, but sometimes it requires approval from the sponsor. Again, you're going to understand that and you're going to know that because you're going to be very familiar with the terms and conditions of the award. This note that NIH no longer permits the grantee authorized official to approve the first 12 months of a no-cost extension. And they are not going to consider extensions for a second year anymore. So the first year, it used to be very easy for us to process an extension for NIH. We would get the documentation and the justification from the principal investigator. They would give us a scientific justification of why they needed an additional year to do their research. And we could just process that through ERA Commons. So that is no longer possible. For the moment, it's no longer possible under the new regulations coming out of the federal government. We have not seen this from some of the other agencies yet, but I expect that the same thing will happen with other agencies that used to permit the authorized official to allow the first 12-month extension of a grant. Here are common changes that require prior approval. This is the NIH grants policy statement, but it was revised in 2024. So some of this information is no longer accurate. I could not find an updated information, but this is something that you need to watch. Every sponsor, like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, is going to have a really good, a lot of good information about the approvals that they need to see and the approvals that they don't need to see. Again, you're going to be watching this because this could be changing on a daily basis in the current environment that we are working under. Subawards. Adding a subaward requires approval from the sponsor. And note that NIH no longer permits foreign-based subawards. That is very new as of May 1st. Carryover of funds. That is when you have a balance of funds remaining at the end of a grant project period, not a project period, but a budget period. Sometimes you can move unexpended balances to the next year automatically. And sometimes the grant conditions will not allow you to do that automatically. Again, you need to understand this, and you're going to understand this by reading the terms and conditions of the award notice. Now, sometimes at Tulane, when we have a PI who is not spending their money, NIH notices that there's a lot of money left, and are we doing any work? And they're going to contact us because they're looking at expenditures and they're flagging that. And so even though we have the ability to automatically carry over money, it can be questioned by the federal agency. So just be aware of that. Foreign components requires approval from the sponsor. Of course, this is something that is also changing for NIH in particular, and I suspect it's going to be applicable to other U.S. federal agencies. Pre-award costs is not really post-award, but you can do pre-award costs 90 days in advance of the official award start date. And that, of course, has to be approved by the grantee authorized official. And I wanted to mention again about the NIH policy update on foreign subawards that just came out. So the policy says that NIH will not issue subawards to US or foreign entities that include a subaward to a foreign entity. They're no longer going to accept prior approval requests to add a foreign component or subaward to an ongoing project. In all cases, and this is something that we're struggling with right now at Tulane, we've got 24 active foreign subawards that we're trying to figure out and guide faculty on what to do about this. But NIH is going to renegotiate awards. They want to remove any subawards to see if any of the work can be performed domestically in the US. And if the project cannot be done without the foreign subaward, they will work on terminating the project. Like I said, this is a very difficult situation for us. We, at the moment, have to work closely with our principal investigators. We're working with our legal office here at Tulane. We're also communicating with program officers at NIH who are trying to give some guidance on what to do. So I know this is very difficult right now, but I do believe, I am sure that NIH says it will continue to provide awards directly to foreign entities. And there is a possibility starting in October, October of this year, they plan to set up a process where Tulane could submit a proposal to NIH, IX could submit a proposal to NIH. The two would be linked as a project. And when an award is made, an award will be made directly to IX, and an award will be made directly to Tulane University. But again, at the award, both at the proposal stage and the award stage, the project will be linked together. So the good thing is that we don't have to work on writing subcontracts, but again, this interim period before NIH sets up that system, we're struggling here to navigate and help our faculty with understanding how to go forward with our projects, our proposals, as well as our active projects that have foreign components and subawards. So that concludes the presentation for today.